Welcome. Today, in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the daily news is so bleak, with so many reports in the media of people in hospital fighting for every breath, the most comforting and reassuring of the images of Jesus is surely that of the healer. It's also one of the most prominent images of Jesus that we find in the Gospels. Indeed, on a couple of occasions, Jesus even appears to refer to himself as a doctor, as a physician, iatros in Greek. The first example comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 2, when Jesus sees the tax collector, Levi, sitting in his booth. He calls out to him, saying, "Follow me." Mark then tells us matter-of-factly that he rose and followed him. Later, Jesus and his disciples were at supper in Levi's house, and we're told that many tax collectors and sinners were there. Ever the guardians of the people's spiritual welfare, the Pharisees were indignant. "Why does he eat with sinners?" they ask his disciples. At which Jesus answered, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but to call sinners." The second example is found in Luke's Gospel. Jesus has just been teaching in the synagogue. Some of the crowd are indignant at his impertinence, as they see it. "Is this not Joseph's son?" they sneer at him. Jesus responds, saying, "Doubtless you will quote me the proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here also in our own country.'" So it would appear that Jesus, in some sense at least, saw himself as a healer, as a physician. And as I say, anyone who glances even briefly through the Gospels will know that healing was a major part of his ministry. Indeed, in the broadest sense of the word, healing was very much the focus of Jesus' ministry. But in order to understand the image of Jesus the healer, we need first to pause for a moment to reflect on the nature and consequences of sickness. Firstly, of course, there is the physical side. There's the pain and debilitating nature of sickness. And when faced with physical suffering, Jesus was deeply, profoundly moved, as we'll see in a moment. But alongside the physical pain, and this is something that has come to the fore in the current pandemic, is that sickness can also affect us psychologically. It can affect us spiritually, even socially. Often, illness is accompanied by a profound sense of isolation, being cut off from family and friends, being cut off from the wider community and our everyday life and activities. Some illnesses can even bring with them a sense of stigma and shame, such that a person is ostracized from society. Here I'm thinking particularly of the stigma that first surrounded AIDS. It's hard to believe now, but when I was in my late teens, there were plenty of people who would look on those with AIDS with disgust, with contempt. Despicably, some even said that it was some kind of divine punishment for leading a wayward lifestyle. Sadly, this kind of attitude isn't new. And it's an attitude that we also find in biblical times. The most notable example was the attitude of people to leprosy. Not only did people have to put up with the physical ravages of the disease, but they were also effectively cut off from society, even from their religion. In the book of Leviticus, we read, "The leper who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall dwell alone in a habitation outside the camp." Another dimension of sickness is that, inevitably, it can sometimes lead to death. And death in the biblical world was very much associated with the power of evil. The Bible is emphatic. God did not create death. Neither did he intend it to be a part of creation. As the Book of Wisdom poetically puts it, God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living, for he created all things that they might exist, and the creatures of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them. Rather, as the Book of Wisdom continues, ungodly men, by their words and deeds, summoned death. Considering him a friend, they pined away, and they made a covenant with him. In other words, in the biblical world, suffering and sickness and death were understood as an expression of sin, of ungodliness, of evil. Jesus, on the other hand, is imbued with the spirit of life, with the spirit of goodness, the spirit of love. And so he wrestles with the powers of evil, releasing humanity from its grip. In the Synoptic Gospels, all of this is bound up with the notion of the coming of God's kingdom, with the reign of God. When God's kingdom comes on earth as in heaven, the chaotic and destructive power of evil and sickness is vanquished, and in its place is established peace and justice and health and fullness of life. Jesus sums this up in Luke's Gospel when he says, "If it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." In John's Gospel, the image that surrounds Jesus' acts of healing is somewhat different. John refers to them as signs, semeion in Greek, signs of God's glory. So, for example, when Jesus learns that his friend Lazarus is dangerously ill, he says, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God." But I wonder, what does the glory of God mean? Well, the word glory translates the Greek doxa. And when we turn to the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Bible made for Greek-speaking Jews in the diaspora, the word doxa usually translates the Hebrew word kabod, which literally means weight or heaviness. And it's a term that was used to refer to God's presence being felt, as it were. So, for example, in Isaiah chapter 60 verse 1, we find, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory, the kabod, the presence of the Lord has come upon you." And so, in John's Gospel, the evangelist is telling us that in Jesus we see the very presence of God among us. And that presence isn't simply in an abstract sense, but through the human actions of Jesus. In particular, in his healing touch, the glory, the presence of God is felt, is made manifest. In Mark's Gospel, the first 24 hours or so of Jesus' public ministry are full of one healing after another. It's quite a breathless scene. People from all across the region bring the sick and those oppressed by demons to be healed by Jesus. Likewise, Matthew tells us that Jesus went all about Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every infirmity among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains. At the end of this frantic 24 hours of healing, as a kind of climax to the day, Mark recounts the powerful story of the healing of a man with leprosy. Now, as I mentioned, those with leprosy were to keep away from everyone else. They were to self-isolate. They were not supposed to come into the towns and villages because they were unclean, physically and spiritually. And yet Mark tells us that a leper came right up to Jesus, that he dropped to his knees and pleaded with him, saying, "If you will, you can make me clean." In the English translation, we read that Jesus was moved with pity at the sight of this poor man. That's a beautiful image, but Mark's Greek is far more vivid, far more physical. It describes Jesus' reaction with the word splanchnizomai, which comes from splanchnon, which literally means the intestines or the guts. In other words, at the sight of this man, Jesus' guts turned over. This was a gut-wrenching experience for him. Then we're told Jesus reached out and he touched the man, something that he was forbidden to do, something that would have made him ritually unclean. And yet, he does it. He reaches across to this man, as if reaching across the great chasm between life and death. And he says, "I will, be clean." And with that, the man was cleansed, which meant, in a sense, he passed from death to life, from the dominion of evil to the dominion of God. Mark then adds an important detail. Jesus told the man to go and see the priest so that he could certify that he was clean. In practice, this meant that the man who had been an outcast from society, who had been separated from his family and doomed to a life of isolation, would once again be able to take his place within the community, within the heart of his family. We see something similar in another powerful healing in Mark chapter 5. It's usually referred to as the healing of the Gerasene demoniac. In this story, Jesus crosses over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee to a Gentile region known as the Decapolis. As he comes ashore, he meets a man possessed by an unclean spirit. The man, we're told, lives among the tombs, that is, the place of the dead. And he was so tormented that not even chains could restrain him. Night and day, Mark tells us, he cried out and he cut himself with stones. When he comes face to face with Jesus, the possessed man cries out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." Jesus commands the unclean spirit to come out of the man. He then asks, "What is your name?" Now, in the ancient world, a name was far more than a mere label. It communicated something about the core of a person's identity. And so to know the name of the demon was to have some kind of authority over it. The demon replies, "Legion onoma moi." My name is Legion, for we are many. And the word legion is curious. It's not a Greek word, it's a Latin word. It's the Latin term for a regiment of about 6,000 soldiers. It's a term that would have struck a chord with the first readers of Mark's Gospel, living as they did under the power and often the oppression of the Roman legions. So by healing the man, by driving out the demons, Jesus not only gives the man peace and brings him back into the place of the living, but also frees him from oppression. And by so doing, he is also restored to his own identity, to his self. In other words, this is a story of redemption. In response, the man begged Jesus to allow him to become one of his followers, but Jesus said no. Instead, he gave the man a mission. Go home to your friends, he says to him, and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And so the man becomes the first evangelist to the Gentiles in the gospel. A man who started out living among the tombs, encounters Jesus and is restored, not only to health and life, but is also given a new purpose and dignity as a messenger of the gospel. In the last of Jesus' signs in John's gospel, we see once again that for Jesus, healing is about the restoration of life. That is, rescuing a person from that which is contrary to God, death, and restoring them to fellowship with God, which is life. So the story goes, Jesus' dear friend Lazarus was dangerously ill, but when they send for Jesus, he doesn't rush to his side, for he knows that Lazarus' illness is destined to be a vehicle by which God's glory will be made manifest. When finally Jesus and the disciples reach Bethany, the home of Lazarus, his friend is already lying in the cold tomb. When Jesus comes face to face with death, we're told that the Lord of life weeps. He then calls out to Lazarus. Come out, he says. And those around him look in astonishment as Lazarus comes out of the tomb. Jesus orders them to unbind him, to free him from the shroud, the cover of death. This is what lies at the heart of Jesus' healing. Yes, there is physical healing, but at the heart, it's about freedom and it's about life. As Jesus brings us into the realm of God, into the loving presence of God. The image of Jesus the healer is a beautiful image. It brings great comfort. It brings hope and peace, especially in these difficult and dark days. It's an image that shows a God who doesn't abandon us, doesn't leave us to suffer, doesn't want us to suffer, but a God who comes to us in order to bring the most profound healing of all. The image of Jesus is also an inspiring image. It has inspired Christians to build hospitals and hospices, orphanages and care homes. It has inspired them to care for the poor, for the sick, for the outcast, for the needy. It has inspired them to pray for the sick and to hold them in love before God. And so, in these ways and in many more, the work of Jesus the healer continues as his people follow his example and as God's peace, God's love, God's life is offered to all people.